So let's begin. In a minute, I'm going to actually talk to you about John Jacob Astor. Just remember that name, because in a few, I'm going to go over that again. But in doing research, Sam and I were going through this, we're looking everywhere, and we're going through literally records and history books and everything else that we could to say, what is the trend? What's happening? In fact, this has been starting from the very beginning of the country, of the foundation. So the first American Depression, actually, folks, started in 1819. It was preceded by the War of 1812. I don't know why Americans thought this way, but they did. And while they were dealing with the Brits, they also had another issue. They decided to try to invade Canada, which was the second time. The first time was like 1773. And let's just say that they lost pretty bad, right? So just imagine they have the Brits that they're dealing with. They go to Canada for whatever stupid reason to go to battle. They lose. What happens when there's a war? The government is borrowing money heavily for what? To finance those endeavors, right? You have a lot of soldiers in the marketplace out there in the field fighting. So what happens when they come back? Not only are they wounded, right? And some of them are really hurt. But now the bank has to deal with what? They're strapped because they threw all this money at the government to get this financed, and now there are no jobs, no opportunities. A complete recipe for a disaster. And folks, do you think the real estate cycle was hurt? Yeah. The real estate market was absolutely hurt during that time. And a lot of other sectors. Farmers actually lost their properties. It was really bad, in fact. And again, you had foreclosures, bank failures, you name it, it happened after the war. Now, it doesn't end there, folks. All of a sudden, very interestingly enough, there's another recession. It's called the Panic of 1837. Is that it was connected with a few components. First and foremost, President Andrew Jackson had decided that he was not going to renew the charter of the bank, of the Federal Reserve, which is what we call today in the U.S. Do you think that created some issues? Yes, absolutely, some panic. But part of why he did that, and he started fighting back, was because he saw that the banks were actually issuing paper notes that were not backed by tangible assets, such as gold or silver, which back then that was the main component, right, of security instruments. So over excessive paper, not backed by tangible assets, a president saying, hold up, stop, and what do you think happens? Creates a chaos. Let's go to the Panic of 1857. Interestingly enough, this was primarily overseas and it hit here as well. In 1857, the British banks actually gave note issuing rights that were not backed by gold or silver to all of their branches and all of their banks. And they overextended the marketplace in 1844. So by 1857, there was a correction that took place. Not to mention that the actual silver was starting to get impacted, so they didn't have the same demand. So the values went down and therefore started creating havoc. It went throughout literally all of Europe. America was affected and many other countries as well. The Long Depression of 1873 to 1879. What happened here is Germany decided to abandon the silver standard completely. The banks started financing and funding what? The railroads. And unfortunately, there was an overexpansion. Over 33,000 miles of actual expansion took place in the railroad here. Now we go to the economic depression. Once again, there's overexpansion. The collapse of railroad financing is taking place because there is no collateral in this financing, right? It's not backed by silver or gold. Overexpansion, and what do you think happens again? This was after what? The Civil War. Now we get to the Great Depression that everybody talks about after all of these cycles. What this particular market correction was so devastating was because it hit country rich and poor. Actually, there was international devastation, incomes were reduced, and in the US, one of the things that was happening during that time is that the government was seeing that there was a lot of import-export business taking place, and they were losing some of their jobs. So instead of the Americans saying, let's raise our standard so that we actually evolve into a bigger country, they said, how do we stop this from happening? So they actually raised tariffs on over 20,000 products. hoping that what that would do is raising the taxes on imported goods would slow down and make people dependent of having to produce product here in America. Well, guess they were wrong, because what that actually did is it set off a storm in the US, and over 50% of the revenue and business that was generated through import-export was completely gone. There's another depression, 1974. What's interesting about this research that we did is that the real estate corrects itself every 18.2 years. Here's another thing that's really interesting. So talking macro here, based on the bullets that I've talked about, what is another common denominator of what I've been sharing with you?
Printing money.
Good point, you're bringing it right in, which is, right, funding. Lenders are coming in, banks are coming in, and they're getting very creative, and they're getting away from what? They're stepping out of the fundamentals, and they're over-expanding, and they're producing revenue. And a little bit later today, I'm going to share with you how that connects in business, okay? But it's really interesting that in every single one of these pieces, either A, the war started it, but they had to borrow for it, or B, they started funding consumers, and they stepped out of the bounds of tangible collateral, and therefore there was a correction because there was an overexpansion. You with me?